Hello, hello out there. What's up, Brian? Trying to see if some more people are going to come in, and then we'll get started. All right. Let's see. All right, so we're going to go over the when statement. We're going to go over the error statement, and we are going to go over some OSC things and some power management, which people have asked about. So that is the first thing we are going to do. And if you have any questions, just type them in chat and I will go over them as they come up. So the first thing we're going to go over is the when statement. So any outlet can have a when statement. So for instance, if you go to, let's just say, a heater, and you go over here, and you wanted to know when that heater has been on for a long period of time, or let's say you wanted to know if the outlet that you're working with has been on for a period of time. Generally, you'll use this on an auto top off, or you'll use this on some form of a, like a calcium reactor, CO2 cylinder, or some form of a device that you want to know if it's been on for too long. So that's when you'll use the when statement. So the when statement is pretty simple. You'll hit when specific outlet. So if let's say, well, we're on the heater outlet. So when it's been on for greater than 5 minutes. And then what you want the outlet to do at that point. Do you want the outlet to shut off, or do you want the outlet to turn on when it's been on for that period of time? So then you'll type in then off. So what that means is if this heater is on for more than 5 minutes, it will then shut it off. And that's how the when statement works. Now, with the when statement, there's something important to note. The when statement will basically disable the auto feature of the outlet that it's on, which means that it's not going to go back to auto. It's going to actually go to off completely. And the fact that it goes to off means any of your programming then will then basically be disabled. So therefore, you have to make sure that if you are using a when statement, that you go back to auto once you've cleared or fixed the issue, in which it's been on for too long. The other issue that comes into play, or the other thing you can do with the when statement, is the error command. So there is an error command, as you can see, in my email configuration, which means that you can put error for any when statement that you've done. So that means, for instance, if the when statement decided to break or decided to go into on state or off state, anytime the when statement does something, you can put an if error and then the outlet and then on. Now what that will mean is that, again, if one of those outlets go from auto to on or auto to off, or they've been on for a long time, it will alert you via the error command right here. So you could do that with any outlet in the entire thing. So for instance, I have an if error Reef auto top off then on, which means it's going to email me if indeed the Reef auto top off comes on, which means if I go back to my Reef auto top off right here, there's a when statement attached to it. So when my auto top off has been on for more than 5 minutes, then it's going to error my email over here, which is right here, which means that the when statement has been met, and therefore the Reef error is then going to email me. Can you use another when statement to go back to auto? You cannot. The when statement only will provide an on or off, and it literally shuts off the switch. It's for safety reasons. That's the whole point that the when was developed, is so that way when something happens, it'll disable the outlet, or in some cases you might want to enable the outlet if it's been on for a period of time or been off for a period of time. You can go in here and put, instead of a when on for 5 minutes, you can put a when off for 5 minutes, meaning if this outlet has been off for 5 minutes, I actually want it to come on. And that's pretty important. I would say for lights or something, I don't know, I've never used a when off statement. So the when statement, like I said, gets tied into the error statement, which can be in your alarm, can be in your email, can be wherever you'd like. There's another thing about the error statements. So the error statements also have their own independent errors based on the product that Neptune makes. So for instance, I have a trident, and in my trident setup, I have an if error trident then on, meaning if there is an error on my trident, I'd like it to turn on. This works currently for all of their pumps, all of their wave power heads, all of their return pumps, anything that is made by Neptune has an error associated with it, and if that error occurs, it will alert you. Now we're going to go down to power here in a second. We're going to go over power management, but this goes for pumps, so their wave pump. This goes for their core pumps. This goes for the Trident. I don't know if it works for any of their modules yet. I don't use it for that, and most people don't need to know an error on a module. If you turn a pump off for maintenance, the when statement would work correct. So what you'll do is you'll want to make some form of a maintenance outlet, which we can go over virtual outlets. And you will see in my diagram here, I have a reef maintenance, I have a fish maintenance, and I have an office maintenance for my 3 different maintenance modes. These are virtual outlets. They have no programming associated with them. They're always off. However, if you go to my email, if my Reef outlet maintenance is on, it turns off the email alerts. It turns off basically any type of alerting during that time as I'm doing the reef maintenance. You could also, as in auto top off, you can also put in here, like I did, if output reef maintenance is on, turn it off, which means when the virtual outlet has been turned on or the reef maintenance has been turned on, it's going to disable the auto top off completely. It's going to turn it off completely. Um, that's how I do my maintenance. You can also put them on feed schedules, but unfortunately, if you put them on feed schedules, after a period of time, the maintenance is then going to turn on everything. So I actually choose to do virtual outlets, which are right here, which we can go into virtual outlets a little bit more in a bit. The next thing we're going to go over is the power statement. There's a lot of confusion on the power statement. So specifically on the power statement, any power block that um, Neptune makes has a special power command. Now, what this means, this is very important. If power is off, then on. Now, I have a number of EB8s and EB4s here. Now, what this basically means, as long as the power block is plugged into the Neptune, and as long as the Neptune is powered by a 12 volt power supply, which is on the unit, this will work. There's also a command here in the settings called power monitor. In order to use any of the power statements, this must be enabled. Now, in order to use any of the power statements, you must have the 12 volt plugged into the apex. So how this works is it basically is telling the apex that you have power through the 12 volt plug. So let's say you lose power on your EB8 or your EB4. As long as the USB is plugged into the apex brain, and as long as the brain is plugged into the 12 volt, it will tell you that that EB8 no longer has power. And that is what the power command is for. So if power to my EB8 is off, meaning it has no power, then alert me. Now, of course, in most cases, the EB8 is powering the apex itself, the brain. So therefore, having that 12 volt power plugged in, it gives the brain power itself. So that way you don't have to worry about an EB8 powering it. There's also something important to know about that. There's a command called if power apex is off, then on. Now what this means is that there is no longer power being supplied to the 12 volt power supply on the apex. So what generally you do here is you will have the 12 volt power supply plugged into the wall, and then you'll have your EB8 plugged into a battery backup. If you do it that way and you lose power, the apex will then know, hey, I lost power, and it will then alert you because the battery backup is still powering the EB8. However, the 12 volt is recognizing no power, so therefore it alerts you. That's how the power command works. Again, you have to have the 12 volt power supply adapter to use it. Okay, are you guys able to see me again? Okay. Yeah, it doesn't show on my screen here that it's working, so oh well. Where were we? We were going with the OSC. So the OSC command is the most complex command that Apex has. And what I've provided in the stream here at the bottom is a OSC calculator. So I'm going to bring that up and I'll show you how I use it. It's a really handy tool. So this guy basically will give you all the information you need to know regarding a OSC. It'll tell you what time things are going to go on. It'll tell you based on your start hour, your stop hour, number of hours, initial time, and what it will do is it'll actually generate the code right up here for you. So if you ever need to do an OSC command, um, I just use this calculator because it's much easier in which to use. So this one is for dosing, and this one is what we call a random event. And what's really nice about this calculator is you could do OSCs for just about anything. And if you're not familiar with OSC means, it means oscillator. And what oscillator means is that it goes on, then off, then on, then off, then on, then off. And this provides a time at which it'll turn on and a time at which it'll turn off, and each day that week, and it will generate the code based on typing in, start hour. Let's do 9. Let's do. Oh, I might have deleted this aspect of the Excel here. There we go. So if we put in 9 o'clock, you'll see that this will change, and we want to allow 13. Let's do off time at 21 here. You can see as I make adjustments here, the coding up here changes. So this basically allows you to make an OSC command without having to really think about it. So that's what I use, and like I said, I linked it in the description of the video. So that's how you use OSC commands. Um, any questions on the power commands? Any questions on the when commands? Those are probably the most common questions I get. The when command is really tricky, and so is the power command. A lot of people hook up the Apex to the bus, to the USB bus, and therefore assume that it's going to then work. However, you have to have that 12-volt power supply plugged in for it to work. There's a whole description on how to do so. If you're not familiar with virtual outlets, you go over here and you will add a virtual outlet. You can name it whatever you want. That virtual outlet will basically do whatever you want it to do. I use a virtual outlet specifically for my reef maintenance, my fish maintenance, my office maintenance. I've used it to combine certain things. So I have two T5 lights, and this is a virtual outlet. Um, you could see the Reef T5 is a virtual outlet, and what I have it doing is when I go to my actual outlets for my T5, which are in here, I'll have to find them. There's quite a lot here. So there's my Reef T5 front, and there's my Reef T5 back. So there's actually two outlets I'm using, and you will see that when the virtual outlet is on, I want you to turn on the outlet. And when the virtual outlet is off, I want you to turn off the outlet. Therefore, I can turn on both of my T5s at the same time, even though they're on two separate outlets. So it's kind of like combining um, the outlets together. And that's what a virtual outlet can do for you as well. So let me put these back, and then Brian will go over the 12 volt power again. So when you're doing any type of power management, and that can be from an EB8, that can be from a just knowing if your apex lost power, you have to use the 12 volt power, which is the little plug in the bottom of it that people don't realize how important that is. In order to use that, however, you have to go in here and you have to enable the power monitoring. When you enable the power monitoring, what you're essentially doing is telling the apex, hey, I got power. Hey, I don't got power. And that's coming from the 12 volt input, not the USB, not the EB8s, none of that. That's basically saying to the apex, I have power from the 12 volts. So generally what you'll do is you'll take the 12 volt, you'll plug that guy right into the power in the wall, and then you'll know if the apex loses power. And the essential next step there is you'd have your EB8 or you'd have your EB4 or whatever unit you're using, and you'd plug that into a battery backup. So that way it enables the apex to continue having power even though you've lost power. So that's how the power command works, and that's how the 12 volt power works. Does that make sense? So we went over the OSC, we went over the power commands, we went over the when command, we went over the air command, a little more advanced stuff. Not still confused. So you are not confused or you are confused? So the EB8, as long as the EB8 is plugged into the USB into your Apex brain, it will power the Apex brain. Um, Now, let's say the EB8 loses power. You were to unplug it from the wall, for instance. The Apex is then going to lose power, essentially. The 12 volt, if you have the 12 volt plugged into the Apex brain, then the Apex brain will not lose power. It'll keep going. So the command for that in my email here, I'll show you, is if power EB8 or EB4 in your case, or EB8 in your case, is off, then on. So what this means is, as long as the Apex brain has a 12 volt power supply plugged into it, and you have power monitoring turned on, when the EB4 or EB8 loses power, the brain will then say, hey, the EB8 lost power, send an email. The opposite holds true if the brain was to lose power. So at the bottom here, if the power of the actual apex, meaning the 12 volt power supply that's plugged into it, loses power, it's going to send an email as well. However, you need to have some form of battery backup to keep it live. So that's where the EB8 then gets plugged into the power or battery backup. So the battery backup is powering the EB8. The EB8 is powering the brain through the USB, and therefore now the Apex knows, hey, I lost power on the 12 volt, but I still have power. So this is why this command's important, because now it's actually telling the um, apex that, hey, I lost power. Yeah, the 12 volt's a great thing to have. A lot of people don't use it. A lot of people don't know how to use it. A lot of people don't know how to use the if power statement. You have to have power monitoring on, and you have to have a 12 volt power supply in order to use the power monitoring feature of the system. Um, and I learned that the hard way, because when I started doing this, I would just put if power and the Apex would lose power and I wouldn't get any alerts, and I'd be like, what's going on here? I have everything on battery backups. But then I realized it's all because of the 12 volt. And I think they sell them on Amazon for like $5. I think it's 12 volt, like 2 amp or something. All right, let's see. Um, yeah, unless we have some more questions, I'll probably end this guy for the first one. We didn't get a lot of people in here, it looks like, so hopefully the next one's a little bigger. Okay, let's see. I don't have 12 volt to brain, although I've received alerts when power is off. I don't know how you can get alerts from the You must be getting the heartbeat alert. That's something completely different. So the heartbeat, that's my assumption. You're getting the heartbeat alert. So what the heartbeat alert is it tells you get a text or you get an email or whatnot that says, hey, we haven't communicated with the Apex in 30 minutes. The Fusion server hasn't connected. That's the heartbeat, which is completely different, like I said, and that's right here. So if heartbeat's enabled, you will get, basically, if it loses communication with Fusion. Now the power command, of course, is immediate, so this would tell you right away if your power was gone. Um, it also you can't do any programming with the heartbeat. So, for instance, you can't tell something to turn on or off if it loses heartbeat, whereas you can with the power. So, for instance, if you lose power and you have a battery backup, you can say, hey, keep this going or keep this on during the battery backup, but turn off other things. So, for instance, my chiller, I don't have any power commands in it, because if the power goes off, I actually want the chiller to turn off, because what's going to happen is it's going to drain my battery backup. Um, but there's certain things like the pump. I need to make sure that's going if it loses power. Prevent RODIs from overfilling. So what I use for um, RODI overfilling is I have a high and low sensor on my RODI container. So I have it with a solenoid, which is the RO fresh and RO salt. These are solenoids on the input or incoming water into the RODI containers, and when those go high, I have them shut off, and when they go low, I have them turn on. and that way I can fill, that's right here actually, I can fill the RODI and it won't overfill ever. I also have a float valve, or a float, yeah, valve. So I don't have to worry about that. Show again program for alert for power off. So there's two different power offs. There is the actual EB8s, EB4s losing power. That's a different command. And then there is a global power off, meaning the brain lost power. So I'll keep going back to my email here because that's where I have them. And this is the command for if the brain loses power. So if power apex is off, I'll explain the time there, then on. So that time right there is a delay. Now what that means is if the power, kind of like the feed mode, if the power is off for 20 minutes, I can extend this for 5 minutes, which means the power has been off for 20 minutes and I don't want this to turn on until 5 minutes after the power has been reestablished. I put this as 0 because if I lose power, I want to get an alert immediately. I don't want there to be a delay of 5 minutes. So basically what this says is, this is my email or my text or my notification. If the power to the apex from the 12 volt is gone, I want you to alert me. And that's what this command is. This command, if power for the EB8, means that the EB8 has been unplugged. And again, this only works if the USB is plugged into the brain and the brain has 12 volt power at the time. So that's how the EB4s, if they lose power, will alert. A little bit different on how that works. I don't know if I explained it, but basically, as long as everything's hooked up and you got 12 volt and you hook up your EB8 to a battery backup, you can do everything that I'm doing. No problem, Brian. I hope I explained it. It's a little confusing until you do it a few times. Okay, let's see. Do you have any other questions? Anything else anyone wants to see while I'm here? Yeah, I got a Mac and it's not as powerful, and it was dropping the stream a few times, but then again, this is my first one, so I'm hoping the next one's a little bit better. Um, but people will look at this after the fact and hopefully learn something. Because I get a lot of questions about power, and I get a lot of questions about how to do some specific things with virtual outlets. I get a lot of questions about that. Um, hey, Ron. Yeah, I'm gonna do them every Saturday morning. I'm hopeful that we can get more people in, get some more questions going. Um, a lot of people have questions about a number of different automation topics. I thought today would be a good start to talk about just Neptune advanced programming things. Um, so we might talk about automating what I'm doing right now, which is automating two fish tanks to uh, share water. So I have two fish tanks in my house now that are distributing water to each other, and therefore I don't have to take care of one of the tanks essentially. It's taken care of by the other tank. So 0 to 10 volt pumps. Okay. Um, Ron, I'm deciding about 10 a.m. my time, which is Mountain Standard. I live in Arizona, so we don't actually have daylight savings. So right now we're sharing Mountain right now. Um, Once daylight savings comes, we share Pacific time. So it is now 10:40 here. So I generally plan on doing them at 10 a.m. I don't know if that's going to change. I don't know if people want it to be at a different time. But I'm gonna try to get some more topics in, get some more people first. But this is the first one. Okay, 0 to 10 volt programming is quite simple. Um, you would need, of course, the virtual, or I'm sorry, the V1, V2, um, and I don't know. I have one thing I'm using for that, and that is my moonlights on my fish tank. So how the 0 to 10 volt works is it uses, I'll try to explain this the best way I can. In electrical terms, when you plug something into the wall, it's 110, 120 volts. What the Apex is doing is it's taking the 120 volt power and converting it to 0 to 10. So consider it like a ratio. So if it's 120 volts equals 10 volts, and of course 0 would equal 0, or 0% to 100%, 10 being 100%, that is the percentage of which the voltage is being sent. So I'm using a moonlight light in my fish tank, which uses a transformer that only supports 0 to 10 volts. It doesn't support 120. There's a transformer. So therefore, to dim it, I'm basically sending a percentage of 10 volts. So 100 would be 10 volts, whereas 9 would be roughly 1 volt if you think about it in the percentages. So that's how it works. There's really not much to it. Um, Same thing with a pump. So if the pump has the transformer in which to convert from the 120 or from whatever to 10 volts, then you're just doing a percentage between 0 and 10. Um, for instance, 50% would be 5 volts, 4 volts would be 40%. And that's how you program the 0 to 10. You program that based off of percentage of the voltage. So I hope that made sense. Um, What am I using to share water between tanks? Well, that is a we're still kind of getting it working, but I am using what's called a liter meter. I don't know if you've heard of a liter meter, but I will show you what it is. Um, a liter meter. So this is a liter meter. It's made by SpectraPure. I have a lot of SpectraPure parts. There's a chance I might actually swap this guy to a Versa, the new Ecotec Versas. But it is a water exchange system, and what it's basically doing is I am taking water out of one tank, dumping it into the other tank, and then taking water out of that tank and dumping it into the other tank. Um, since my Nano is only 7 gallons, I am dumping roughly 15 gallons per day into that tank and removing it. So therefore, it's relatively a 200% water change on a daily basis. Um, Had it running now for about a week. I am noticing on my Nano things are starting to look a lot better. I think it's because now it has water from my 100, which has tons of filtration, going to a tank with almost no filtration. Um, and my numbers have been stable in both tanks, and now I don't have to worry about dosing. I don't have to worry about anything because I have a calcium reactor on my big tank. So it's just sharing the water, and it works really well. Yeah, well, the dose is not only too loud, however, it's very slow. The liter meter packs a, I mean, I think I have it here. You can see. First of all, it'll pump up to 60 feet. So this thing's going um, across my house. But what's really nice is this thing can pump between 100, I think it's 150 and 200 milliliters a minute. So it's very quick. The water exchange throughout the day, I can hear it about every 15 minutes, and every 15 minutes takes maybe 20 seconds for it to do the exchange. If I did a dose, it'd be on all day swapping 15 gallons. 15 gallons, is a lot to transfer through the 1/4 inch RO tube, 70 feet in my house. So it would take a while. Yes, it's a water transfer. We're not really changing water. We're taking water from one tank, putting it in the other one, and then doing the opposite. Um, and it's been working. So that's the liter meter. I love the liter meter because you can have three different pumps on it. So I'm using two pumps on it, and you can program it to do pretty much whatever you want throughout the whole day. And and it's about the same price as a dose. So I didn't see the reason to try the dose. The other thing is this thing can pump probably 100 feet without a problem, without fail. I mean, I got one of these pumping to my other tank. I got one of these pumping. I'd use all of their pumps for my water changes. I use all those pumps for my auto top offs because they're just so fast and quick and can send significant distances, which I don't know if the dose would be able to handle it. But like I said, I am definitely interested in those Ecotec Versa pumps because they're supposed to do basically the same thing, and they have a lot more controllability. They're a lot smaller than the liter meter. I can also hide them behind the tanks. Yes, you're doing 1 gallon. So imagine if you did 15 gallons. Yeah, the loudness alone would drive me crazy. But the fact, if you think about it, if you're doing 1 gallon, yeah, think about how it can do. Well, the Versa I would just locate behind each tank. So I'd put one Versa behind the Nano and one Versa behind the 100 and just have it push the opposite way. Um, I don't think I don't know exactly much about them yet. I think there's going to be some stuff online soon about them. I don't even believe you can get them yet in most places. Um, but they're small, they're powerful. I know people that are going to use them for calcium reactors because I'm being told they are 24/7 pumps, so they can go all day, which is huge. They're super quiet, which is amazing. For me, I don't like a lot of noise. So, so we have any other questions? So Brian, I just put the liter meter pump. They have extension pumps, or they have like how do I explain it? Remote pumps. So I put the remote pump behind the Nano over here, and I have the main pump by the 100. So they're not really running backwards. I just put them in a location to push them a certain direction. So let's see, we're at, we've been on here for about 50 minutes. Wow. So any other questions anybody has about anything, I could show them. Like I said, I'll try to do this every weekend, unless people tell me they want to do it a different time, different night, different day. I want to try to make it. I want to try to make it so people can see everything that I do and answer any questions. So, um, yeah, Jessica, you can see my Nano. The camera cord isn't very long, so just give me a moment. This is my Nano. If you give me a moment, I can extend the cord. Just give me a moment. I have an XR15 Radeon on the Nano. There you go. I got a new Scully right there. He's pretty cool. Got some mushrooms, some zoas. Nothing crazy. And yep, there is a XR15 on it, Radeon. Yep, I have everything hooked up to the Apex. I don't know if you could see it. It might be a little dark. Let me get a light. Yeah, I can make the Nano full screen. Give me 1 second. Yep, so I got I got an EV4 in there. Just a couple basic things in here. Yeah, I don't know when Mark does his stream. I don't ever watch it, so there we go. So there's my new Scully there. There's not much in here. It's a what, a 10 gallon. Well, there's really only about 7 gallons in here. And then hey, you can see the tubes right there. That comes from my 100 and exchanges water. That's what it's doing. It's pulling and pushing water there. So yeah, I just got a couple of things down here. I just got FMM for sensors. I got the WXM for my Radeon. And yeah, I got a little EB4 there, and then underneath there I got a pH and does my temp. But again, like I was mentioning, I also have a battery backup, of course, sitting on the ground right here. But as I mentioned earlier, this tank now shares the water with my 100-gallon tank, so 100. So really the only thing I'm testing on this is the temp, just to make sure it doesn't get really hot. here in my office. I have a little fan on it, and the pH, and that's really it. I don't really do anything else with it. Um, let's see. Melives, yeah, good old Mark. What else? Yeah, I mean, I could change the time of the stream. Wasn't sure if Saturday mornings were going to work. I could do it anytime. I work at home, so I could do the stream whenever. I would probably, if it was my choice, I would probably want to do it on a Thursday evening, or possibly a Monday evening. Um, but I know a number of people don't work Saturday morning, so I figured this would be great. But yeah, I'm getting used to the streaming, and I might put some other stuff in here next time. We can maybe go over um, Reef bot or whatever you want to do. Um, I just have an APC 1500. I have five of them in the house. One for my AV equipment, one for one fish tank, one for another fish tank, one for the other fish tank. Um, I have a ton of battery backups for multiple different things. Since I have so many alerts, the battery backups are great. But I generally get an alert beforehand, and therefore I don't really worry about power or anything. I'll just come home and fix it, or I'll have someone come by the house and fix it. Um, but the APCs, I only put certain things on them. So I only put, you know, a low pump or something just to keep the fish alive. Um, in my large 300 gallon, I have on the battery backup the protein skimmer and the return pump. That's it. So therefore, if anything was to happen in that tank, they're going to get their oxygen, and the sump's going to still basically keep going. MP40s. So I have those on the Ecotec battery backup, and I have the same thing on my 300. So the secondary redundancy there is so I can, if the power was to go out, and if it was to go out for a long time, let's say 3 or 4 hours, I do have the Ecotec battery backup doing the pumps at least, so that helps me. But yeah, I think the most important thing with having a reef tank and reef automation in general is having sensors, having leak sensors. Um, then, I mean, it depends on your life, because some lifestyles, no, you're not home all the time. For me, the good news is I am home all the time. I work from home, so if I get an alert, I am there and I fix it. If I go on vacation, I have someone I know that does a really good job of watching the house, and will take care of it. Um, but I can't stress enough, if you have an Apex system, how important sensors are, leak sensors are. Um, on the Nano specifically, I have a high optical sensor, so that way, if the water was to get too high, it'll shut off the pumps so it doesn't overflow into my office. Certain things like that I think are more important than um, having these gigantic battery backups. I think you're fine with just doing, an Ecotec for their pumps, or those little tiny USB ones that power those DC pumps really well for hours and hours and hours. Um, Even just a bubbler, even just a battery bubbler in the tank will save a lot of life. Usually oxygen is the first thing to go. I have reflow hammer. What battery backup do you suggest? So those hammerheads drain a crap load of power. So you're going to want to do actually is to look at APC's commercial line, not the ones you find at like Best Buy. They have these, I can't remember what they're called. Let me see if I can find them online for you. They are very specific power battery backups. So they have, your commercial grade, and then they have the, I don't know what we call them. Consumer grade would be the right word. And let's see if I can find it. They are a little more pricey. I will just tell you that right off the bat. But they are a lot better than your other ones. I think they are I don't believe that's it. They are right here. Let me go back. I will find it. Okay, so these are back UPS. These are all what we call in my business the consumer grade back UPS. Do not use those for your pump. You're going to want to use a smart UPS, which I believe I was on already. Now the smart UPS units, such as this one here, will significantly be better. They even have 2200s here, but you can see the price goes way up. But I would try something like 1,000 right here. I wouldn't go any higher than that. If you're just plugging in your hammerhead and that's all you're plugging in, I would have to imagine you're going to get 2 hours out of this guy just for your pump, if that's all you're plugging into it. But what's nice about APC, I don't remember where it is on this website, is you can actually type in your voltage, and it'll tell you if you're going to how long it's going to last and so forth. There's a calculator somewhere. I don't know where it is though. But the biggest thing that this has is the sine function, the wave type here, sine wave. It's a little more advanced for me. I don't know exactly what it does, but what I do know is that it keeps higher powered, higher amperage devices going for a longer time. It also provides over voltage protection, which is huge because you see it has 600 watts. If you were to plug in a vacuum, let's say, or you were to plug in something that's going to just completely demolish the voltage and kill your battery backup, these smart UPSs have over voltage sensing and therefore actually don't do anything. I have one here in my office, and if you were to over voltage it, it just basically says, "Oh well, I'm over voltage." Whereas these consumer grade ones they'll just die, and you usually have to replace the battery if you're over voltaging them. Chillers specifically, these are good for chillers if you ever needed a battery backup for a chiller. I hope that helps. I would stick with the smart UPSs. I have just a cheapo backup UPS for the Nano here because all I'm powering is that little Mighty Jet, so it doesn't need much. On my bigger tank, I have a dual battery backup system in there. So car battery. I've heard of people doing that. I don't have the answer to your question on that. I don't. I'm not a do it yourself guy. I like to buy something that I have a warranty on. Um, uh, car batteries in general are known to fail quite often. Um, as I'm sure you know, I'm replacing batteries on one of my car all the time. You could give it a try for sure. Oh, they do, huh? That's a good advice, Brian. I can do that in about half a second. Check that out. How's it look now? Yeah, we were having some glitches earlier, but you know, I was able to get it working finally. For all the people that have joined late, we went over a number of things in the beginning of the video, which you can watch, specifically on how to do errors, power management, OSCs. I have a link to an OSC calculator for you that if you ever are trying to do an OSC command, this will just do it for you. Yeah, Brian, that's the right thing to do. I mean, I tell everybody leak sensors are tremendous investments. Um, I think optical sensors too. I don't like float switches. I think float switches fail. I've had better success with optical sensors. I know people that say they have problems with optical sensors. I will tell you from experience that the reason people have failed optical sensors most of the time is due to dosing or due to precipitant or calcium precipitant on those optical sensors. If you keep them away from your dosing pumps, you keep them away from anything other than just salt water with a lot of good flow going to them, you will not have an issue with optical sensors. Um, I probably have 20 optical sensors in my system. I have yet to replace one in I don't know how many years I've had this going. Um, I think those two things are very important. And I think I mentioned that in a couple streams that I was on myself. So, any other questions from anybody? Looks like we have a few more people now. Yeah, again, the optical sensors, if they're not getting, well, if you're using an optical sensor that doesn't get water, you got to make sure that it's not getting splashed with water. You got to make sure that it's not getting hit with water. Um, I would definitely say that the ATO, I'm assuming you have the ATK, the Neptune one. I have to say I don't like the placement of those sensors. The problem is they, when the water comes out of the ATO, it goes right over the sensor, and eventually, like you said, you have to keep cleaning them. I took the sensors out of that and I just moved them. Um, I don't like the placement of them. What's up, Devin? We are programming nothing right now. We're just kind of chit-chatting. I've been in the stream for almost an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes. The beginning of the stream, we talked about programming errors and power commands, OSC commands. Specifically, we talked about how the power management works on a Neptune. A lot of people ask about that. Um, and we also talked about virtual outlets, and we talked about OSC commands. So we've talked about quite a bit. And then we showed off my Nano a little bit. Yeah, I think that's right. Flip the side of the optical. I think that's great. If you just switch them around like Devin said there, I think that's the right thing to do. The problem is they get hit with water and then it just dries up and then you get salt creep and then the optical sensors stop working. Yeah, I had the stream set for 10 a.m., so I don't know. Maybe I'll do it later in the day for those people who like to sleep in. But I don't know. I might do them Thursday evenings. Some people had requested that. A couple people requested Monday evenings. Um, we had a couple good questions. You know, um, I talked about more of the advanced stuff, so I'd like to talk. I'd like to get people to ask specific things so that way I can help them. The whole point of these streams are really going to be to help people that are struggling getting um, programming done. Deferring, that's another one I want to talk about. Defer statements and min time statements. A lot of people don't know how to use that properly. Um, and I had another guy call me. My alarm's just going off constantly, and it all comes down to defer statements, and that's a big thing we can talk about next time. Yeah, I know. I don't know how to fix that. Um, 10 a.m. my time is pretty much mid-afternoon for most people here in the United States and Canada. But your time at 4 is good. I don't. I have to come up with a good time for everybody. Yeah, we talked about a lot of stuff, man. Brian was the big man today. He asked the most questions. I didn't get a lot of questions from many people. All right, so anybody have anything else before I go? Yeah, we could do that. That's not a problem. Yeah, today's topic was specifically the power management, the when and error statements. I really wanted to hit home on that. So we talked about that a little bit in the beginning. Um, I think that was very informative if you watch it back. But yeah, I'd like to talk about a few other more advanced topics down the road. Um, but yeah, I'm down for anything. Anybody can ask any question about whatever reefing, you know. Been doing this for a long time. I had my first fish tank when I was 6 years old. Well, Aaron, that's what I'm here for, to make it so you're not tech illiterate. All right, well, I'm going to close up shop. I appreciate everyone that did come, and I appreciate everyone that did join and spend some time with me today. I really appreciate it. And hopefully next one we have some more people, and hopefully next time we discuss a few more things, and it only go up from here. So everyone have a good day, and I will talk to you later.